Imagine your world turning upside down in a matter of seconds. Judge Olivia Harris, a respected legal figure, faces an unimaginable nightmare when a routine traffic stop takes a dangerous turn. Pregnant and vulnerable, Olivia's life is thrown into chaos as dark secrets come to light. What begins as a personal fight for justice spirals into a battle for her family's safety and the truth behind a corrupt system. Curious about how far Olivia will go to uncover the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit that subscribe button to follow this thrilling journey of courage and resilience. Judge Olivia Harris leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the last few pages of the court transcripts spread across her desk. Outside her office window, the golden hues of the late afternoon sun reflected off the towering buildings of downtown, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a breathtaking view, but Olivia barely noticed. Her mind was occupied with the final rulings she needed to make before she could head home for the evening. At 36 years old, Olivia was one of the youngest federal judges to be appointed in her district. Her meteoric rise through the legal ranks had drawn both admiration and criticism, but she had earned her reputation as a fair, intelligent, and tough-as-nails judge. However, behind the composed exterior, Olivia was feeling the strain of juggling the demands of her high-stakes job with the impending arrival of her first child. Her hand instinctively drifted to her swollen belly, feeling the soft but steady kick of the baby growing inside her. She smiled faintly, closing the transcript and setting it aside. The baby seemed to have a way of reminding her to slow down, to step away from the relentless pace of her career, even if only for a moment. "Almost time to go home, little one," she whispered, rubbing her stomach gently. It had been a long day, filled with hearings and deliberations. Olivia had presided over a particularly difficult case involving allegations of police misconduct, one of many such cases she had seen in recent years. The country was in the midst of a tense reckoning over systemic racism, especially within law enforcement, and Olivia found herself at the center of many legal battles addressing those very issues. She sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She knew she couldn't fix the system on her own, but every decision she made in her courtroom had the potential to set a precedent, to push things toward justice. Glancing at the clock, she realized she had worked later than she had intended. Her husband, Daniel, was probably already at home, preparing dinner and wondering why she hadn't called. Olivia smiled at the thought of Daniel, her rock through everything. He was a civil rights attorney, just as passionate about justice as she was, and they often spent evenings talking about their cases, exchanging thoughts, and challenging each other's views. But now, with the baby on the way, their conversations had shifted to more personal matters. Parenting, balancing their careers with family life, and the future they wanted to create for their child. With a sigh, Olivia stood up and gathered her things. The courthouse was quiet now, the usual bustle of the day fading into the calm of evening. She nodded to the security guard as she made her way to the underground parking lot, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. The drive home was a familiar one, winding through the city streets, past the landmarks she had come to know so well. Olivia let her mind wander, thinking about the nursery she and Daniel had almost finished decorating. The soft pastel colors they had chosen gave the room a peaceful, serene feeling. She smiled, imagining their baby lying in the crib, the two of them standing over her, filled with wonder and love. As she approached a red light, Olivia's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen. Daniel's name appeared, along with a photo of him smiling at their wedding. "Hey, love," Olivia answered, her voice light and tired at the same time. "Hey yourself," Daniel's warm voice came through the speaker. "I was starting to wonder if I'd have to send a search party." Olivia laughed softly. "I'm on my way. Just wrapping up a long day. How's dinner coming along?" "Almost ready," Daniel replied. "I figured we'd take it easy tonight. I made your favorite, baked ziti. Thought we could relax and maybe watch a movie." "That sounds perfect," Olivia said, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease a little. "I could use a quiet night." There was a brief pause in the line before Daniel spoke again, his tone more serious this time. "How are you feeling? You've been pushing yourself hard lately. I worry about you, Liv." Olivia smiled, touched by his concern. "I'm okay, Daniel, I promise. Just trying to get everything in order before the baby comes. You know how it is." "I know," Daniel said softly, "but don't forget to take care of yourself too. You're not just a judge, you're a mom now, and that means you get to slow down sometimes. Olivia's smile widened. I know, I'm working on it. Good, Daniel said, his voice full of love. I'll see you soon. Drive safe, okay? I will, Olivia promised before hanging up. As she continued driving, Olivia let herself relax at the thought of spending the evening with Daniel. No court cases, no deadlines, just the two of them, together in their little bubble of peace before their world changed forever with the arrival of their baby. As Olivia turned onto one of the quieter residential streets near her home, she noticed the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, and she frowned, glancing down at the dashboard. Her speed was well within the limit, and as far as she could tell, she hadn't missed any stop signs or run any red lights. Must be a mistake, she muttered to herself. Still, Olivia knew the drill. She signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park and rolling down the window. Her mind raced, going over her actions. What could she have done wrong? She wasn't in a rush, hadn't made any illegal turns. None of this made sense. The police cruiser pulled up behind her, and she watched in the side mirror as the officer got out of the car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his walk had a certain swagger to it. Olivia's unease grew as she noticed the way his hand rested on his holster, his face set in a grim expression. Stay calm, Olivia, she told herself, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. You know your rights. Officer Roberts, his nameplate gleaming under the streetlight, approached the car. His face was hard, his eyes cold as he leaned down to peer into the window. License and registration, he barked, not bothering with any pleasantries. Olivia blinked, caught off guard by his tone. Good evening, officer, she said, keeping her voice polite and steady. May I ask why I've been stopped? You failed to signal at that last turn, Officer Roberts replied sharply, his eyes narrowing. Olivia's frown deepened. She knew she had signaled it was second nature to her, but something about this officer's demeanor told her that arguing would only escalate the situation. Of course, Olivia said calmly, already reaching into her purse for her license and registration. Here's my license. As she handed over the documents, Officer Roberts glanced at the license, then back at her, his scowl deepening. His eyes flicked to her belly, but there was no softening in his expression. Instead, his face hardened even more. Step out of the car, he ordered. Olivia felt a jolt of alarm. Excuse me? She asked. Her voice was still steady, though her pulse quickened. Officer, I'm 7 months pregnant. I don't believe stepping out of the car is necessary. Robert's hand moved toward his holster, his grip tightening on the handle of his gun. I gave you an order, he said, his voice louder and more aggressive. Step out of the car, now. The fear that had been simmering in Olivia's stomach flared into something more acute. She had presided over too many cases involving police violence to not recognize the danger she was in. This officer wasn't following protocol. He was looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. Officer, I don't wish to escalate this situation, Olivia said, her voice still calm but firm. I'm more than happy to comply with any reasonable request, but as I mentioned, I'm pregnant and concerned for my safety. Could we resolve this while I remain seated? Robert sneered, his eyes flashing with anger. You think you can talk your way out of this, huh? You people always think you're above the law. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. You people. The words sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about something much darker. Step. Outside office the car? Robert said again, his voice seething with barely contained rage. Olivia felt her fingers tremble as she reached for the door lock. She knew she had the right to remain in the car, but every instinct screamed at her that resisting would only make things worse. All right, she said quietly, unlocking the door. She slowly pushed it open and stepped out, her movements careful and deliberate, mindful of her swollen belly. As soon as she was halfway out of the car, Officer Roberts grabbed her by the arm and yanked her the rest of the way, pulling her upright with such force that she stumbled, her hand flying to her belly. What are you doing? Olivia gasped, wincing as his grip tightened painfully around her arm. Please, I'm pregnant. You're hurting me. You people always think you can do whatever you want, Roberts muttered, his voice thick with disgust. Let me show you what happens when you think the law doesn't apply to you. Panic surged through Olivia's body. Officer, please! Before she could finish, his hand shot out, slamming her against the side of the car. The cold metal of the car door pressed against her cheek, and a sharp pain shot through her side. "Stay quiet," Roberts hissed, glancing around as a few people on the sidewalk started to gather. Their phones went out, recording the scene. Olivia's vision blurred as her mind raced with fear and confusion. This was not happening. She was a judge, a respected member of the legal system. How had a routine traffic stop turned into this? "Please," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm pregnant." Roberts ignored her, his fist connected with her face, the impact sending a shockwave of pain through her skull. Olivia's world spun as she crumpled to the ground, her hands instinctively flying to her belly to protect her baby. The pain was overwhelming, but her only thought was for the child growing inside her. The crowd around them erupted in shouts, their voices growing louder, but to Olivia they were distant, drowned out by the ringing in her ears. She tried to stay conscious, but the darkness was closing in, her vision blurring as the pain radiated through her body. "Call an ambulance!" someone screamed. "She's pregnant!" Through the haze of pain, Olivia heard the screeching of tires as another police car pulled up. A new officer, this one familiar to Olivia, rushed over, his eyes wide with horror. "Judge Harris!" the officer gasped. "What the hell happened?" Olivia's next moments were a blur, flashing lights, distant voices, the feel of a stretcher beneath her as paramedics carefully lifted her off the pavement. The sound of sirens filled the air, and Olivia struggled to focus, to stay conscious. "She's 7 months pregnant," one of the paramedics said urgently. "We need to get her to the hospital now." "Daniel," Olivia whispered, her voice weak, her vision darkening. She could feel her body trembling, the adrenaline rushing through her veins, but all she could think about was her husband and their unborn child. The paramedics worked quickly, securing her onto the stretcher and rushing her into the ambulance. As they closed the doors, Olivia's world finally faded to black. When Olivia Harris woke, her world was a haze of sterile white walls, beeping monitors, and the faint hum of activity outside the room. The ceiling lights were too bright, and the sharp smell of antiseptic made her head swim. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she felt so heavy, like her entire body had been weighed down with lead. Then the memories hit her, like a freight train. Officer Roberts, the flashing lights, the cold metal of the car door against her cheek, and the searing pain as his fist connected with her face. She gasped, instinctively reaching for her belly. "The baby!" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Panic surged through her veins, her heart racing as she struggled to sit up. A gentle hand rested on her arm, stopping her. "Olivia, it's okay." She turned her head toward the voice and saw Daniel sitting beside her, his face drawn and exhausted. His eyes, normally full of warmth and strength, were now clouded with worry. "Daniel," Olivia whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "The baby, is she okay?" Daniel's grip on her arm tightened slightly, his voice soft and reassuring. "She's fine, Liv. The doctors ran all the tests. Our baby girl is strong." His voice cracked, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You're both going to be okay." Olivia's entire body sagged with relief, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The familiar flutter of movement reassured her that her baby was indeed still with her, and alive. "I thought," Olivia's voice trembled, "I thought I'd lost her." Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight with emotion. "No, Liv, you're both safe now." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Olivia's mind raced with questions. What had happened after she lost consciousness? What was going to happen now? How had everything spiraled so horribly out of control? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel gently took her hand in his. "Officer Roberts has been suspended pending investigation," he said, his voice grim. "But that's not enough. I'm filing charges, Olivia. He's going to pay for what he did to you. I won't let this go." Olivia closed her eyes, the weight of the ordeal pressing down on her. She had spent years on the bench, ruling over cases of injustice and violence, never imagining she'd one day become the victim of the very system she was trying to fix. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Why did he do it?" "Because he could," Daniel said bitterly. "Because he thought he'd get away with it. He didn't know you were a judge, Liv. He just saw a black woman and figured he could do whatever he wanted." Olivia's heart sank at the truth of Daniel's words. She had presided over too many cases involving systemic racism, police brutality, and abuse of power to be naive about what had happened. But knowing the truth didn't make it any easier to accept. "What happens now?" Olivia asked softly, turning her head to look at Daniel. "What happens to us?" Daniel's eyes were hard, his jaw set in determination. "We fight, Liv. We fight like we've never fought before. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about every person who's ever been in your shoes, every person who's been assaulted or harassed by someone who thought they were above the law." Olivia swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "But what if—" She hesitated, her hand resting on her belly. "What if something happens to the baby because of all this stress? I don't know if I can handle this, Daniel." Daniel's expression softened, and he leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "We'll protect her, Liv. I promise. I won't let anything happen to you or our baby. But we can't let Roberts and the people like him win. They need to be held accountable." Olivia nodded, though the exhaustion of the past few days weighed heavily on her. She had always been a fighter, but now with her child's safety on the line, the stakes felt higher than ever. She wasn't sure she had the strength to fight this battle, but Daniel's resolve was unshakable, and she knew he wouldn't back down. Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "We'll fight." The next morning, Olivia woke to the sound of the television in her hospital room. The news was on, the volume low, but the images flashing across the screen sent a jolt of reality crashing over her. Her face, swollen and bruised from the assault, was plastered across every major news network. The footage of her being yanked from her car by Officer Roberts had gone viral, and the video of his brutal assault had sparked outrage across the country. The media firestorm had begun. "Judge Harris assaulted in traffic stop," the headline read. "Pregnant federal judge beaten by officer," another headline flashed. The scene was replayed over and over. Roberts grabbing her, slamming her against the car, and the punch that had sent her crumpling to the ground. The crowd's horrified reactions and the calls for an ambulance filled the air, and Olivia's stomach turned as she watched it all unfold from a distance, as if it had happened to someone else. Daniel stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched the news in silence. His face was set in a grim line, the tension in his body unmistakable. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said quietly, his eyes not leaving the screen. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." Olivia's heart sank. She had seen how these cases played out in the media, how victims were scrutinized, their every action dissected, their character questioned. Even though she was a judge, she knew the public wouldn't be kind, especially once the defense started spinning their narrative. "I didn't want this," Olivia whispered, her voice strained. "I didn't want to be the face of another case of police brutality. I just wanted to go home." "I know," Daniel said softly, turning to look at her. "But you didn't choose this. Roberts did, and now the whole country is watching." Olivia felt tears welling up in her eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had always believed in the justice system, believed that the law could be a tool for good. But now, sitting in that hospital bed, bruised and battered, she wasn't so sure. "What if they don't believe me?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they say I did something to provoke him?" Daniel crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, taking her hand in his. "It doesn't matter what they say. We have the video. We have witnesses. They can spin it however they want, but the truth is on our side." Olivia wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. She had seen too many cases where the truth wasn't enough, where justice wasn't served, and the system protected its own. "I don't know if I have the strength for this," Olivia admitted, her voice cracking. "You do," Daniel said firmly, squeezing her hand. "You've always been the strongest person I know, and you're not alone in this. We're going to fight this together." The day after the assault, Daniel wasted no time in taking legal action. He and his law partner, Samantha Green, met at the hospital to lay out their strategy for the lawsuit. Samantha had been a fierce advocate for civil rights cases for years, and she had a reputation for taking on the toughest battles and winning. "This case is going to be a war," Samantha said, her voice calm but intense as she sat across from Olivia and Daniel in the hospital room. She laid out a stack of legal documents on the small table beside the bed. We're going after Roberts for assault, but we're also building a case against the police department for enabling this kind of behavior. There's a pattern here, and we need to expose it. Olivia nodded, though the idea of launching a public legal battle was daunting. What kind of pattern? She asked, her voice still weak from the trauma of the assault. Samantha flipped open a file, showing Olivia a list of complaints against Officer Roberts. He's been involved in several incidents of excessive force and racial profiling. Every time the department buried the complaints, but this time, we have video evidence, and we have the public on our side. Daniel's jaw clenched as he looked at the documents. We're going to make sure they can't sweep this under the rug. Roberts needs to be held accountable, and so does the department. Olivia's heart raced as she processed the information. She had seen similar patterns in her courtroom. Officers with long histories of misconduct, protected by a system that refused to hold them accountable. But now she was the one at the center of it. We'll need to move fast, Samantha continued. The longer this drags out, the more opportunities the defense will have to spin the narrative. We need to control the story. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The idea of being thrust into the public eye was terrifying, but she knew they couldn't back down now. Too much was at stake, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been victimized by the system. Olivia said, her voice firmer this time. Let's do it. As the lawsuit gained traction, the backlash began. Daniel and Samantha worked tirelessly to gather witness statements, video footage, and any evidence they could find to build a strong case. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. One evening, as Olivia rested in the hospital, Daniel arrived with a letter in hand, his face pale with anger. They're threatening us, Daniel said, holding the letter up for her to see. Olivia's stomach churned as she read the words scrawled across the page. Drop the case, or your family won't be safe. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Daniel, fear tightening her chest. Who sent this? I don't know, Daniel said, his voice tight with fury. But it's clear someone doesn't want us to go through with this. Olivia's heart raced. She had expected resistance, but not this. Not threats against her family, against her unborn child. The fear she had tried to keep at bay crashed over her in a wave. What are we going to do? Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's face hardened with resolve. We're not backing down. If they think they can scare us into dropping this case, they've got another thing coming. Olivia nodded, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. They were entering dangerous territory, and she knew that the fight ahead would be even more brutal than they had anticipated. The stress of the lawsuit, the threats, and the constant media attention began to take its toll on Olivia. She stayed in the hospital under observation for several more days, the doctors monitoring her and the baby closely. Every time she looked at herself in the mirror, the sight of her bruised face reminded her of the nightmare she had lived through. At night, when the hospital was quiet and Daniel had gone home to rest, Olivia would lie awake, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She worried about the case, about the safety of her family, about the toll the stress was taking on her baby. I'm scared, Olivia admitted one night, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke to Daniel over the phone. I don't know if I can handle this. You don't have to handle it alone, Daniel said softly, his voice full of love and reassurance. We're in this together, Liv. We'll get through it. But even with Daniel's support, Olivia couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong, that the stress of the lawsuit would harm their baby, or that the threats would escalate into something far more dangerous. As Samantha continued to dig into Officer Roberts' history, she uncovered a shocking pattern of misconduct that went far beyond one rogue officer. Captain Thomas Monroe, the head of internal affairs at the department, had been covering officers like Roberts for years, ensuring that complaints of excessive force and racial profiling never saw the light of day. We've got a real problem here, Samantha said during a late-night meeting with Daniel and Olivia. Monroe has been orchestrating cover-ups for years. He's protected officers like Roberts from facing any consequences for their actions. But we have the evidence now. Emails, internal memos, everything. Olivia's heart raced as she listened to Samantha lay out the full extent of the corruption within the department. How deep does this go? She asked, her voice steady despite the shock she felt. Deep, Samantha replied. It's not just Roberts. There are several other officers involved. But Monroe is the key. If we can take him down, we can expose the entire system. Daniel's jaw tightened. We're not just going after Roberts anymore, he said, his voice filled with determination. We're going after the whole department. Olivia nodded, her resolve hardening. This was no longer just about what had happened to her. It was about taking down a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. The legal battle against Officer Roberts and Captain Monroe was in full swing, and the pressure was mounting. The media coverage was relentless, the protests outside the courthouse growing larger by the day. Civil rights groups rallied behind Olivia, calling for systemic reform and accountability within law enforcement. Inside the courtroom, Olivia felt the weight of the fight pressing down on her. The defense was doing everything they could to discredit her, using fabricated evidence to cast doubt on her character and actions during the traffic stop. But Olivia remained steadfast, knowing that the truth was on her side. We can't let them win, Olivia said to Daniel one evening as they sat together in her hospital room. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been wronged by this system. Daniel nodded, his face etched with determination. We're not stopping until we see real change. As Olivia prepared to take the stand and testify against Officer Roberts, she knew that the battle was far from over. But with Daniel, Samantha, and the public by her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were going to win, and when they did, it would change everything. The day Olivia Harris took the stand was one she would never forget. The courtroom was packed, with reporters crammed into every available space, their pens poised, their cameras flashing as she walked into the witness box. Protesters chanted outside the courthouse, their voices echoing through the hallways. The tension in the air was palpable, and the weight of the moment pressed down on Olivia's shoulders. Daniel sat in the front row, his face a mixture of pride and worry as he watched her prepare to testify. Samantha stood beside him, a stack of legal documents at the ready. Officer Roberts sat at the defense table, his expression blank, his defense attorney, David Turner, beside him. As Olivia took her seat, she glanced at the jury, 12 people who held the power to decide her fate. They were ordinary citizens, some young, some older, but each of them had their own biases and beliefs. Olivia knew that her testimony would have to be compelling enough to break through whatever preconceived notions they held about race, law enforcement, and justice. She took a deep breath as Samantha approached, her voice calm but firm. Judge Harris, can you please describe, in your own words, what happened on the night of the incident? Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she began to recount the events of that night. The flashing lights, Officer Roberts' aggressive demeanor, his demands, and the moment he yanked her from her car, ignoring her pleas that she was pregnant. Her voice remained steady, though inside she felt the familiar pang of fear and anger bubbling beneath the surface. As she described the assault, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. The jury leaned in, their eyes fixed on her as she detailed the exact moment Officer Roberts struck her. The pain that radiated through her body, and the fear she felt not just for herself, but for her unborn child. I told him I was 7 months pregnant, Olivia said, her voice growing stronger as she relived the memory. I told him he was hurting me, but he didn't care. He pushed me against the car, and then he punched me. I thought I might lose my baby. There was a collective gasp in the room as Olivia's voice broke slightly. She could see the jurors shifting in their seats, some of them visibly shaken by her testimony. Samantha stepped back, giving Olivia a moment to collect herself. And after Officer Roberts struck you, what happened next? Olivia took a deep breath, her hand instinctively resting on her belly as she spoke. I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My husband was there, and the doctors told me that by some miracle, my baby was unharmed. Samantha nodded, her voice steady. Thank you, Judge Harris. No further questions. David Turner stood and approached the stand, his expression cool and calculated. Olivia knew this was the moment the defense would try to discredit her, to paint her as the one who had escalated the situation. She steeled herself, ready for whatever Turner had to throw at her. Judge Harris, Turner began, his voice smooth and professional, you've described a traumatic event, but I'd like to ask you, did you, at any point during the traffic stop, resist Officer Roberts' instructions? Olivia met his gaze, her voice firm. I followed his instructions exactly, even when I knew he was wrong. Turner raised an eyebrow. And yet, you claim that Officer Roberts felt the need to use force. Could it be possible that, in the heat of the moment, you appeared uncooperative or defiant? Olivia felt a surge of anger at the insinuation, but she kept her voice measured. I was not uncooperative. I was afraid. He was escalating the situation, and I was trying to protect myself and my child. Turner nodded thoughtfully. Of course, but could it be possible that Officer Roberts, mistakenly perhaps, felt threatened by your actions? Olivia's eyes narrowed. I was 7 months pregnant, sitting in my car, complying with his orders. There was nothing about my behavior that could have been perceived as threatening. Turner smiled faintly, his tone turning more aggressive. Isn't it true, Judge Harris, that as a federal judge, you are aware of how to manipulate the legal system to your advantage? Couldn't it be said that you're using your position to turn this incident into something it wasn't? A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Olivia's heart raced. She knew this was coming. The defense would try to paint her as a woman abusing her power, but she wasn't going to let them twist the truth. I am not here because of my position, Olivia said firmly, her voice rising with emotion. I'm here because Officer Roberts assaulted me, and he should be held accountable for his actions, just as anyone else would be. The jury's eyes were on her, and she could feel the tide turning. Turner had tried to plant doubt, but Olivia's conviction was unshakable. She had spoken her truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide. For a moment, Olivia thought they had the upper hand. But just as she felt a sense of victory, Turner pulled out a stack of documents that sent a chill down her spine. Your Honor, Turner said, addressing the judge, the defense would like to submit new evidence into the record. We have uncovered traffic camera footage showing that Judge Harris failed to signal at a previous intersection, contradicting her testimony. Furthermore, we have witness statements that suggest she resisted Officer Roberts' lawful instructions. Olivia's stomach dropped. The footage was doctored. She knew she had signaled. And the witness statements? Those must have been coerced or fabricated. But it didn't matter. The defense had planted the seed of doubt, and she could see it reflected in the jury's faces. Samantha immediately stood, her voice sharp. Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is clearly fabricated. We demand the opportunity to review its authenticity. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Objection overruled for now. The defense may proceed, but the evidence will be subject to verification. It was a blow, and Olivia could feel the momentum slipping away. Turner had played his hand well, and now the jury wasn't just questioning Roberts' actions. They were questioning hers. As the trial dragged on, the stress took its toll on Olivia. The fabricated evidence, the constant media scrutiny, and the weight of the public's expectations began to feel unbearable. Every night she lay awake in bed, her hand resting on her belly, worrying about the impact all of this was having on her baby. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Olivia admitted one evening, her voice barely audible as she sat beside Daniel in their living room. The baby monitor hummed quietly on the coffee table, and outside the distant sound of protesters could still be heard. Daniel turned to her, his face etched with concern. Liv, you're the strongest person I know. We're almost there. We can't give up now. Olivia shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. But what if something happens to the baby? What if all this stress? I don't think I could handle it if something went wrong. Daniel took her hand, his voice full of quiet determination. Nothing's going to happen to you or our baby. We're going to get through this, but we have to keep fighting. Olivia leaned into him, her heart heavy with fear and exhaustion. She had always been a fighter, but now, with so much on the line, she wasn't sure if she could keep going. Just when things seemed darkest, a glimmer of hope arrived in the form of Officer Miguel Martinez. A fellow officer in Roberts' precinct, Martinez had been a witness to the corruption and cover-ups orchestrated by Captain Monroe. He had seen Roberts' abuses of power firsthand, but fear of retaliation had kept him silent, until now. Martinez reached out to Daniel and Samantha, offering to testify against Roberts and Monroe. He had seen enough and could no longer live with the weight of what he knew. I've been part of the department for years, Martinez said during a private meeting in Daniel's office, and I've seen things that should never have been allowed to happen. Monroe's been covering for Roberts and others like him for a long time, but I can't stay silent anymore. Samantha's eyes lit up. You're willing to testify? Martinez nodded, though his face was pale. Yes, I'll testify, and I'll bring the documents I have. Monroe has been manipulating evidence, coercing officers and bearing complaints. If we take him down, we take the whole system down. Olivia felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. This was what they needed, proof that corruption went beyond Roberts. With Martinez's testimony, they could finally expose the full scope of the department's cover-ups. But Martinez's decision came with risks. As soon as word got out that he was willing to testify, he became a target. The threats against him escalated, and Daniel and Samantha knew they would have to act fast to protect him. We need to make sure he's safe, Daniel said, pacing the floor of their living room later that evening. If Monroe finds out he's willing to testify, they'll come after him. Olivia nodded, her heart pounding. And if they silence him, we lose everything. The day Officer Martinez took the stand was a turning point in the trial. His testimony was damning, exposing years of corruption, cover-ups, and abuses of power within the police department. He detailed how Captain Monroe had orchestrated a culture of impunity, where officers like Roberts were free to act without fear of consequences. The department has been protecting Officer Roberts and others like him for years, Martinez testified, his voice steady but emotional. Monroe made sure that any complaints against them were buried, and that anyone who tried to speak out was silenced. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Martinez produced the documents he had promised, emails, reports, and internal memos that confirmed everything he had said. The defense scrambled to discredit him, but the damage was done. Martinez's testimony had shifted the tide in Olivia's favor. As Olivia sat in the witness box watching Martinez expose the truth, she felt a renewed sense of hope. They were finally getting to the heart of corruption, and the jury was beginning to see the full picture. Martinez's testimony sent shockwaves through the city. The media exploded with coverage of corruption within the police department, and protests outside the courthouse swelled to unprecedented numbers. Civil rights leaders called for systemic reforms, and public pressure on the police department mounted. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Every day, new revelations came to light, and the defense's attempts to discredit Olivia and Martinez became increasingly desperate. But the public was no longer willing to accept excuses. They wanted accountability. Olivia felt the weight of the public's expectations pressing down on her, but for the first time since the trial began, she believed they had a real chance of winning. Martinez's testimony had turned the tide, and now the focus was on taking down Monroe and the entire system that had enabled officers like Roberts. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Olivia sat in the courtroom beside Daniel, her heart racing as they waited for the verdict. It had been a long and grueling battle, and the outcome of the trial would determine not just her fate, but the fate of a system that had been corrupt for far too long. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide everything. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Roberts, guilty of assault and civil rights violations. A wave of relief washed over Olivia. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek as she realized it was over. They had won. Justice had been served. While the verdict against Officer Roberts brought a sense of justice, Olivia knew that the battle was far from over. The systemic corruption within the police department had been exposed, and now the focus shifted to Captain Monroe, the man who had orchestrated cover-ups for years and enabled officers like Roberts to act without fear of consequences. The media swarmed outside the courthouse as Olivia, Daniel, and Samantha walked out, flashes of cameras momentarily blinding them. Civil rights leaders and activists were holding signs, chanting for justice. They had taken the first step by convicting Roberts, but now the public wanted more. They wanted the entire corrupt structure dismantled. "Monroe's next," Daniel said as they climbed into their car, his face set in determination. "We've got the evidence. Martinez's testimony was enough to push this investigation to a federal level." Olivia nodded, feeling both the weight of the victory and the enormity of what lay ahead. It wasn't just about Monroe. It was about the entire system that had protected him and his officers. But the verdict had given her hope. The fight wasn't over, but they were gaining ground. That evening, as they watched the news from their living room, Olivia's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Samantha. "Olivia, you need to see this." Attached was a link to a news report that had just aired. The headline read, Captain Monroe under federal investigation. Police department braces for further charges. Olivia's heart raced as she watched the report. Monroe had been arrested earlier that day, led out of his office in handcuffs. The footage showed him with his head held high, his face emotionless. But the pressure of years of covering up abuse and corruption was finally closing in. Daniel leaned back on the couch, his expression unreadable. It's finally happening. Olivia nodded, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Monroe wouldn't go down without a fight. As Captain Monroe's arrest dominated the headlines, the backlash began to intensify. Olivia, Daniel, and Martinez became the targets of vicious smear campaigns, both online and in real life. Anonymous threats flooded their inboxes and appeared on social media. Protesters outside the courthouse grew more agitated, with counter-protesters showing up to defend Monroe and his officers. It wasn't long before things took a darker turn. One night, as Olivia and Daniel were sitting down to dinner, they heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering in the front of their home. Olivia jumped, her heart racing as Daniel rushed to the front door. There, lying on the living room floor, was a brick wrapped in a piece of paper. Daniel's face darkened as he picked up the note, reading it aloud. Back off, or your family won't be safe. Olivia's hands shook as she stared at the note, the reality of the threat sinking in. This wasn't just about legal battles anymore. This was about their safety, their child's safety. We need to call the police, Daniel said, his voice tight with anger. But Olivia knew better. Calling the police wouldn't solve this, not when the very people they were fighting against were entrenched in the system meant to protect them. We'll protect each other, Olivia said quietly, taking Daniel's hand. But we can't let them intimidate us. Daniel's eyes softened, though the tension in his body remained. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or Grace. I promise. But Olivia knew that the threat was real, and the fight they were engaged in was more dangerous than ever before. As the investigation into Captain Monroe widened, so did the scope of their case. Federal prosecutors were now involved, and the evidence Martinez had provided opened the door to a series of lawsuits against not just Monroe, but several other high-ranking officers in the department. Civil rights groups began organizing, rallying behind Olivia as a symbol of the fight for justice. But with every step forward, more resistance. Pro-Monroe rallies were held outside the courthouse, and media outlets sympathetic to law enforcement began running stories that painted Olivia, Daniel, and Martinez as agitators out to destroy the police force. Olivia felt the pressure mounting. Every time she left the house, she was met with reporters hounding her for statements, activists calling for interviews, and people demanding she be the face of the reform movement. I didn't ask for this, Olivia said one night as she sat with Daniel, her hands trembling. I never wanted to be the face of this. Daniel sat beside her, his face filled with understanding. You didn't ask for it, but you can't deny the impact you've had. People are looking at you, Liv. You've inspired them. Olivia leaned back, feeling the exhaustion weighing her down. But at what cost? I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared for Grace. For us. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. We're in this together. We're going to protect Grace, and we're going to see this through. We can't let them win, not after everything we've fought for. Olivia nodded, though the fear gnawed at her. She knew they couldn't turn back now, but she also knew the fight ahead was going to be harder than anything they had faced before. While Olivia and Daniel braced for the next phase of the legal battle, Officer Miguel Martinez found himself in increasing danger. Since his testimony, he had been receiving threats from people within the department. Fellow officers who had once been his friends were now turning against him. He was branded a traitor, and Monroe's supporters were doing everything they could to discredit him. One night, Martinez called Daniel, his voice shaking. I think they're following me. There's been a car outside my house for the last few days, and I'm getting phone calls, blocked numbers, but they don't say anything. Daniel's jaw tightened as he listened. We'll get you protection, Miguel. You can't back down now. I'm not backing down, Martinez replied, his voice firm despite the fear. But they're closing in on me, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Olivia felt a pang of guilt as she overheard the conversation. Martinez had risked everything to expose Monroe, and now his life was in danger. They had to do something to protect him, something to keep the fight going. "We need to get him out of the city," Olivia said once Daniel hung up. "We can't let Monroe's people get to him." Daniel nodded, his expression hard. "I'll call the federal prosecutors. We'll get him into witness protection if we have to. But if Martinez is silenced, we lose the key to this whole case." Martinez's life was turned upside down in the weeks following his testimony. He had to leave his home, constantly change locations, and was under federal protection as the investigation into Captain Monroe deepened. But despite the danger, Martinez never wavered in his commitment to the case. The day he was called to testify again, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The media coverage had reached a fever pitch, and protesters on both sides gathered outside in record numbers. Inside, the courtroom was packed as Martinez took the stand, his face pale but resolute. Samantha began her questioning. "Officer Martinez, can you tell the court what you know about Captain Monroe's involvement in this case?" Martinez took a deep breath before answering. "Monroe has been covering up misconduct for years. He pressured officers, including myself, to falsify reports, destroy evidence, and silence complaints. He did it to protect officers like Roberts and others who were involved in racial profiling and excessive force." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Martinez continued, producing the documents he had kept hidden for years, emails, internal memos, and reports that exposed the full extent of Monroe's corruption. Samantha handed the evidence to the judge. "Your Honor, we submit this as Exhibit A. These documents prove that Captain Monroe and his department have been systematically covering up civil rights violations for years." The judge reviewed the documents, her expression growing more serious by the minute. "The court will review this evidence thoroughly. Officer Martinez, thank you for your testimony." As Martinez stepped down from the stand, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Monroe's web of corruption was unraveling, and the weight of Martinez's testimony had shifted the balance in their favor. The revelations in the courtroom sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets broadcast testimony on a loop, and the protesters outside the courthouse doubled in size. Civil rights leaders held press conferences, calling for immediate reforms, while police unions scrambled to defend Monroe and the department. Olivia and Daniel watched the news coverage from their living room, their hearts heavy with the realization that the fight was far from over. "This is just the beginning," Olivia said quietly. "We've exposed Monroe, but the system that protected him is still standing." Daniel nodded, his face filled with determination. "We're going to take them down, Liv. We're not stopping until we see real change." Olivia leaned into him, feeling the weight of the moment. The battle had been long and exhausting, but now more than ever, she knew they couldn't stop. With the public's attention firmly on the trial, federal prosecutors moved swiftly to expand the investigation. Captain Monroe and several other high-ranking officers were indicted on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The city was in turmoil, with protests and counter-protests erupting in every corner. Olivia found herself at the center of the storm, with activists calling on her to lead the charge for reform. But the pressure was immense, and every day, threats against her and her family escalated. "We need to stay focused," Samantha said during a late-night strategy meeting. "The public is with us, but we can't lose sight of the bigger picture. Monroe's conviction is just the first step. We need to push for systemic change." Daniel agreed, though Olivia could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "We'll keep going, but we have to be smart about this. The threats are getting worse." As they prepared for the next phase of the trial, Olivia knew that they were entering the most dangerous part of the fight. Monroe's conviction was within reach, but the battle for systemic reform was only just beginning. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the jury returned with their verdict. The media was in a frenzy, with reporters vying for the best shot of Captain Monroe as he sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Captain Thomas Monroe, guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted into chaos, reporters shouting, protesters cheering, and Monroe's supporters crying out in disbelief. But amid the noise, Olivia felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. They had won. Monroe's reign of corruption was over. As Olivia left the courthouse, Daniel by her side, she was met with the cheers of the protesters who had been fighting alongside her for so long. They had taken down Monroe, and now the fight for true reform could begin. It had been a week since Captain Monroe's conviction, and life for Olivia, Daniel, and their newborn daughter Grace was beginning to return to some semblance of normalcy. The public outrage, the protests, and the media frenzy had begun to settle, leaving behind a city that was still grappling with the changes that lay ahead. Olivia sat on the porch of their home, rocking Grace gently in her arms. The late afternoon sun bathed the yard in a warm glow, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Olivia could finally breathe. "We did it," she whispered softly, looking down at Grace's sleeping face. "We really did it." But even as she said the words, Olivia knew the fight wasn't truly over. Yes, Monroe had been convicted, and systemic corruption within the police department had been exposed. But that was only the beginning. The public was still calling for widespread reform, and the task of rebuilding trust between the community and law enforcement would take years. Daniel walked out onto the porch, his face softening when he saw Olivia and Grace. He pulled up a chair beside her and sat down, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "You were incredible in there," Daniel said, his voice filled with admiration. "You never gave up, even when things got tough. And because of you, things are going to change." Olivia smiled faintly, though the exhaustion of the last few months weighed heavily on her. "We did it together, Daniel. I couldn't have done it without you or Samantha or Martinez. This was all of us." Daniel reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I know, but you were the one who stood up first. You didn't back down when they tried to silence you. And because of that, Grace is going to grow up in a better world." Olivia looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love. Grace was the reason she had fought so hard, the reason she had endured the threats, the fear, and the relentless pressure. She wanted a world where her daughter wouldn't have to fight the same battles she had, a world where justice was truly equal. "I just want her to grow up safe," Olivia whispered. "I want her to grow up in a world where people like Monroe don't get to walk free for so long." Daniel's face softened. "She will, and we're going to make sure of that." As the weeks passed, the city began the slow and painful process of rebuilding. With Monroe's conviction, a wave of reforms swept through the police department. A civilian oversight board was established, new leadership was brought in, and officers like Roberts were dismissed from the force. It was a long, hard-fought battle, but the groundwork for change had been laid. Civil rights leaders and activists continued to push for more, demanding systemic reforms on a national level, and Olivia found herself at the center of it all. She had become a symbol of justice and resilience, her name synonymous with the fight for accountability and fairness in law enforcement. But for Olivia, it wasn't about the fame or the recognition. It was about making sure that the work they had started didn't go unfinished. "I want to be involved in the reform process," Olivia said one evening as she and Daniel sat at the dinner table. "I want to make sure the changes we fought for actually happen." Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "You've already done so much, Liv. No one would blame you if you took a step back, especially with Grace here." Olivia nodded, her heart tugging at the thought of spending more time with her daughter. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her work wasn't done. "I know," she said softly, "but this is important, Daniel. If we don't see this through, if we don't hold them accountable, everything we fought for could be undone. I can't let that happen." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, his eyes filled with understanding. "You've always been a fighter, Liv. I know you're not going to stop until it's done. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. Grace needs her mom, and I need my wife." Olivia smiled, grateful for his unwavering support. "I won't forget," she promised, "but I have to do this." In the months that followed, Olivia became a key figure in the city's reform efforts. She joined the Civilian Oversight Board, working alongside community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights activists to ensure that the changes promised during the trial were actually implemented. It wasn't easy. The resistance from certain factions within the police department was fierce, and Olivia found herself once again the target of online smear campaigns and anonymous threats. But she refused to back down. She had seen too much, fought too hard, and lost too much to give up now. One day, as Olivia was leaving a board meeting, she was approached by a young woman who looked familiar, but whom she couldn't place right away. The woman's eyes were wide with admiration, and there was a slight tremble in her voice as she spoke. "Judge Harris?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Olivia smiled warmly. "Yes." The woman hesitated, then spoke quickly, as if she had been rehearsing the words for a while. I just wanted to thank you. My brother, he was harassed by the police for years. No one ever listened to us, but after your case, things changed. He finally got justice because of you. Olivia's heart swelled with emotion. She had heard similar stories in the months since the trial, but each one touched her deeply. I'm so glad to hear that, she said, her voice soft with sincerity. Your brother deserved justice. The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. You gave us hope. Thank you. As the woman walked away, Olivia stood still for a moment, watching the world move around her. She hadn't set out to be a symbol, but in many ways that was what she had become. Her fight had opened doors for others to seek justice, to stand up against the wrongs they had suffered. Later that evening, as she sat in Grace's nursery, rocking her daughter to sleep, Olivia reflected on the journey they had been on. The fight had been long and grueling, but it had been worth it. They had made a difference, and that difference would ripple out for years to come. You're going to grow up in a better world, Olivia whispered to Grace as she rocked her gently. I promise you that. 6 months after Monroe's conviction, the city had begun to heal. The police department was under new leadership, and the reforms Olivia had fought for were slowly being implemented. It wasn't a perfect system. Change was slow and there were still challenges to overcome, but progress was being made. Olivia continued her work with the Civilian Oversight Board, though she had scaled back her public appearances. The media attention had faded, and she was able to focus more on her family and her work behind the scenes. Daniel had taken on several new civil rights cases, inspired by the progress they had made, and together they continued to fight for justice, both in the courtroom and at home. One evening as they sat on the porch, watching Grace play in the yard, Olivia leaned back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of peace settling over her. Do you think we did enough? She asked quietly, her eyes on Grace. Daniel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. We've done more than enough, Liv, but we're not done yet. There's still work to do, and we'll keep fighting. But what we've accomplished, it's more than I ever thought possible. Olivia smiled, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment. I just want her to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to fight like we did. Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with the same determination that had carried them through the darkest days. She won't. Because of you, things are different now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their journey settling around them like a warm blanket. They had fought hard, sacrificed a lot, and came out the other side stronger for it. Most importantly, they had secured a future for their daughter, a future that was brighter, more just, and filled with hope. The years ahead would bring new challenges. There was no doubt about that. But as Olivia watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, she knew they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they would continue to fight for what was right. Together, they would raise Grace in a world that was fairer, kinder, and more just than the one they had grown up in. And as Olivia rocked Grace to sleep that night, she knew that their victory had not only changed their lives, but had paved the way for countless others. It was a new dawn for their family and their community, a dawn that promised hope, justice, and a brighter future for all. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on stories that matter, stories of justice, resilience, and change. Hit the subscribe button below and join the movement for a better tomorrow.